They laughed when they handed her the keys. It was the kind of laughter that makes a church hush feel like the world itself is turning away. Rain stitched tiny rivers down the coffin lid. Naomi stood with Isaiah at her side, the hem of her coat heavy and damp, her belly already rounding with the child she would carry into the months ahead. The lawyer's voice seemed to come from the bottom of a well. The house split between two names, shares transferred, and the 1972 delivery van to Naomi Carter. It should have sounded like a small mercy. Instead, the van became a rejoinder, a punchline delivered by her father-in-law and his daughter, slick and sure, until they were at the front doors, and Naomi was left holding what looked like nothing at all. They followed her to the long, tired vehicle, as if escorting a lost thing. The van smelled of old oil, of damp curtains, and a cigarette someone had dropped years ago. Its paint was a tired blue, its chrome pitted and eaten with rust. Inside, the seat creaked, and the vinyl had given up. A cracked coffee mug rolled under the passenger footwell. Her brother-in-law, with an impatient smirk, tapped the hood and said, "Keep it. Maybe you can use it for spare parts." There were cameras in the world that made the moment smaller than it felt. Theirs were in the heads of people who had decided Naomi was a liability, not a partner. Later, Isaiah would remember the look on Naomi's face as she slid the key into the ignition and felt the engine cough awake like a throat clearing itself. It started on the third try. The heater blew air like a tired animal. Naomi wrapped her coat tighter around her belly and watched her son's small hands curl into the sleeve. She kept her chin lifted because dignity has edges even when everything else is ragged. For the first nights, the van was a refuge and a confession both. Naomi learned the peculiar geometry of sleeping in a space meant for transport. How to stack blankets to make a backrest, how to prop the baby seat at an angle that wouldn't spill Isaiah when he slept. Condensation feathered the windows each morning, and Isaiah drew ships and suns with a little finger on the glass. They called their small inventory of possessions the bundle. A suitcase with a thin sweater for Naomi, books Isaiah refused to leave behind, a battered toolbox that had belonged to her husband, and a shoebox with pictures. Naomi would sit on the bumper and hold a cup of tea too small to warm her hands, and feel the valley of the city spread out, indifferent and bright, beyond the lamppost. Work was a string of questions with no answers. Naomi pinned herself to odd jobs, the way a boat pins to a dock. She scrubbed cafes' brass door handles at 4 in the morning for cash that paid for a bag of rice and a few oranges. She mended aprons for a bakery during an afternoon lull. When she could, she arranged flowers, sprigs of eucalyptus, the stubborn blush of carnations, newspaper cones of herbs, for customers on the market's margins. Naomi had learned the rhythm of blooms, from years of helping her husband at the family shop, the slow, faithful work of trimming stems and coaxing arrangements to say what words could not. It was muscle memory now, a quiet economy of hands. The van kept them sheltered, but it also kept them small. There were nights Isaiah would wake and climb into Naomi's lap and ask questions about his father, as if storehouse answers might come with the dawn. Naomi would listen, sometimes answering with stories, sometimes with a silence that held what grief could not yet speak. She always smoothed the blanket at his shoulders, tucked his hair behind his ear, and whispered the name of the child in her belly as if it were a promise, softly to herself. Rose. Months do strange things to people. They turn urgency into routine and what once felt like exposure into a practice of care. Naomi learned to make lists and cross out survival with the same neatness she used to wire a bouquet. Bills were a landscape to be navigated, not an avalanche to fear. There were small compensations that steadied the days. Isaiah's laugh when the corner of a tulip petal tickled his nose, the way a stranger at the market would tell Naomi their story as they picked a bunch of greenery, the slight respect in the way regulars asked if she'd arrange their table for an anniversary. The market became a kind of outpatient clinic for hope. small talk, small purchases, the exchange of kindness for cash. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, crouched over a wheelbarrow of old potting soil, that Naomi noticed something that unearthed the quiet edifice of her days. She had been scraping at a seam where rust had eaten thin the metal of the van's inner panel, trying to tidy a spot that had caught dirt and the ghost of spilled coffee. Her fingernails scritched away a scale of orange corrosion, and beneath a thin line flashed. Not tin, not steel, but something warmer, held light differently. For a second she thought it was a trick of the sun. Isaiah, who was helping by folding up old newspapers, saw her freeze and said, "Mom?" Naomi pressed her thumb to the spot and felt a smoothness, a coolness that resisted the history of decay. She scraped a little more, careful, like a conservator revealing a painting's true color. It wasn't a seam of rust. It was a strip, narrow, long, and deliberately hidden, laid under the panel, its edges tucked like a secret. She did not exclaim. She did not stand up and shout. Naomi folded herself into the van's doorway and looked at Isaiah's small face, which had now become a mirror for hers. Her heart did something minimal and private. It steadied. She could have told the in-laws. She could have taken it straight to the lawyer and demanded the world return what had been taken. But Naomi had been learning a new grammar, how to turn indignation into strategy, how to make increments matter. She thought of Isaiah and the child she would soon hold. She thought of the long nights and the small mercies. A quick win would not heal their history, and a loud exposure would only invite a new kind of fight. Instead, she taped the seam closed, as if it had never been opened, and carried the discovery like a prayer. The jeweler's shop was a simple place tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, the kind of narrow storefront with a faded brass sign and a bell that announced you without much ceremony. The jeweler himself, a man with rimless glasses and hands that were more machine than flesh, accepted small things without questions. Naomi brought him an envelope folded thick with cloth. She had taken careful thin slices from the strip over the course of weeks, shaving them almost like giving the van a haircut. Small, unnoticeable, the metal almost microscopic. She left a keepsake of the van's rust on her palms, and an address not given in full. The man counted the pieces and the weight and placed a small envelope in her hands, with a look that was more storekeeper than conscience. It was enough to buy warm milk for a month and new ribbon for the bouquets, and crucially, the courage to think that perhaps grief could be recalibrated into work. Those early sales were measured like vows. No sudden extravagance, only what would sustain. Naomi learned the marketplace of secrecy, how not to sell too much at once, how to make years of poverty look like a slow thrift set aside rather than a sudden turn toward wealth. Each small payment was added to a jar labeled "Shop" in Naomi's neat, careful handwriting. Isaiah would drop coins into it like seeds, as if he believed in the slow miracle of gardens. Naomi used the money to rent a morning stall space at the outdoor market, then to buy burlap and buckets and the last of the season's dahlias. She priced bouquets honestly and tied them with the dignity of someone who knew the cost of beauty. The first morning Naomi set up her stall, she thought of how small the thing was. 2 folding tables, a hand-lettered sign, and a scattering of flowers arranged like a ledger of color. She named it for the people who had kept her moving, Isa and Rose. The name was private at first, just a way of reminding herself that everything she did was for 2 small futures. Customers came because she was good, because she had the eye to make the shy things sing, and because there was warmth in the way she bundled stems and tucked notes into paper cones. People started to come back for her recommendations, to ask if she had more roses, to tell her about their mother's birthday or their neighbor's recovery. Word moved like water in the market. Soon, Naomi had regulars who left small cards and a silver spoon with a bent handle. There were setbacks, Days when a cold snap killed half the stock overnight, when a supplier was late and Naomi had to make do with wildflowers she had foraged from a verge. There were nights Naomi slept in the van and woke with the mark of a new blister from a knot tied too tightly, yet still she rose and drove to the market before the first light. She sold to people who talked quietly about their griefs, to couples buying a bundle to forgive one another, to an elderly woman who bought the same bouquet every Thursday and asked Naomi if her son was asleep. Naomi answered with a soft constancy, "Yes, he's sleeping, or he will be here," or sometimes she simply smiled and wrapped the stems a degree more carefully than the last. Meanwhile, the in-laws' world, which had once seemed so secure, began to fray. They had taken control of the house and the shop and the line of suppliers that had once hummed like a small, efficient engine. For a while it looked like victory. They threw a party in the house with too many glasses and music that tried too hard. But their hands were not trained for work that had once been steady. Orders were missed, attention wandered, and people who had valued the old family's quiet competence began to grumble. Suppliers who had once been loyal faced invoices that were late by weeks. Small creditors find cracks in what looks like solidity. Rumors collect in those cracks. Naomi heard, through a friend in a bakery and through the worried voice of a former supplier who stopped by the market, that the in-laws had been cutting corners. A delivery went wrong and a wedding went without bouquets. A business page printed a short paragraph about missed payroll. It was not a catastrophe so much as a slow emptying, like a tub drained by a hairline crack. Naomi watched it unfold with a small, steady empathy that was not pity. She did not revel. Instead, she kept returning to the work that rebuilt her days, taking orders, sending her son on small errands, learning how to store stems overnight so they looked fresh in the morning light. Her life was an accumulation of small competence. Where the in-laws relied on flash, on the presumption that what had been theirs would remain so, Naomi invested in the long arc. Relationships with customers, a reputation for truth, a willingness to be there when someone needed a blossom arranged before a funeral. As months drifted, the stall became a small corner shop. Naomi found a room with a green awning, hidden between a cafe and a locksmith, with a window that let in gold light in that forgiving hour of late afternoon. She painted the sign herself in the evenings, simple letters, the name folded into a sentence of love, Issa and Rose. The shop smelled like eucalyptus and citrus and old paper, and the newborn wrapped in a basket by the counter was the reason the name finally felt right. Rose came in a storm of blood and hush. Naomi labored and breathed and named her child in the quiet that follows new life. Isaiah would stand in the doorway of the delivery room with the look of someone who had just seen a small star and could not unsee it. When Naomi brought Rose home, she placed the baby in a woven basket beside the counter, because the shop was family, and the family found its center in work and in the way customers cooed and left with a sense of being cared for. Naomi's sales were honest products of time and taste. She had sold off those strips of metal in dribs and drabs, always small enough to avoid suspicion. The money was a seed, not a sudden treasure. It paid for a second-hand display fridge, for nails and paint, for a small signboard to lean outside on market days. Naomi paid a cleaned, honest rent and opened herself to the slow calculus of business. Good product, good word of mouth, persistent ethic. The shop attracted people who had been lonely for a place that felt like careful hands. A woman who sold jams at the next stall would drop by each month and say, "It looks like a haven." Naomi would smile, sometimes thinking of the blue van parked half a block away, like a quiet monument to what had been necessary. The in-laws' collapse, meanwhile, took its own shape. It was not divine unmaking. It was missed payments, a house that grew quieter as belongings were moved out in boxes and silent vans, a credit line that was pulled back. The way gossip can be a slow drip that corrodes even the best-laid plans. Their children left town. Their social invitations dwindled. People who had once courted their favor now frowned when asked about them. Naomi heard about them in fragments, a neighbor explaining that Henry had bargained away the last supplier for less money than it was worth. Lila taking an ill-advised loan to keep appearances. The house that had once been the site of the family's prosperity started to look like someone else's dream pasted over a decline. When the in-laws finally came to Naomi's shop, they were not demanding the return of what they'd taken. They were asking for the small mercies people ask of strangers when other walls have crumbled. Lila stood at the threshold with a coat that was too thin for the stretch of cold that had settled in her jaw. Henry's mouth was a blue line. He had grown small under the collapse. They hovered in the doorway, looking at the newborn in the basket, at Isaiah with a flower behind his ear, and at Naomi, who tied a ribbon around stems with the same slow deliberation she had always used. "We're having trouble," Henry said. His voice tried for humility, but landed as a question. "It would be helpful if we could—" He reached for a word that fashioned itself into stay. Lila's hands were folded as if in a habit of polished pleading. Naomi listened. Her hands didn't stop working, but the rhythm altered, and for a breath she considered what help would mean, opening a door to people who had closed one on her, letting history enter as if it had never mattered. She thought of Isaiah's small, steady work, arranging the shop's front window with a paper swallow. She thought of Rose, tiny and forever dependent on the core of what Naomi had built. She thought of dignity, of principle, of the long shape of justice that does not scream, but sets its face. "I'm sorry," Naomi said simply. The words were not sharp. She folded a bouquet and wrapped it in brown paper, the way someone bundles up a decision. "I don't have a spare room." Henry's shoulders slumped like a flag in weak wind. Lila's eyes burned briefly, and then their faces settled into something that looked like acceptance, or like an understanding that the world had gone on without them. They left with a small paper bag of neutral sympathy, the kind of minor token a person offers when the thought of larger amends is too heavy to carry. Naomi's refusal was not a triumph. It wasn't spoken with a victory in it. It was held like a hinge, quiet and necessary. She did not gloat, she did not taunt. She had no appetite for reshaping people into punishment. Rather, she protected the life that had been entrusted to her. 2 children, a small shop that hummed with honesty, and a future stitched together by labor and grace. Months later, the newspapers and the neighborhood talk did what gossip does. They stacked the in-laws' missteps into a narrative of decline. A headline here reported an eviction. A paragraph there murmured about overdue invoices and emptiness in rooms where furniture had been sold under pressure. Naomi kept a clipping or two in a drawer, but did not set them on the counter for display. Her life did not need the scaffolding of others' misfortune to support its joy. Sometimes she would walk back to the van and run her hand along the seam where the strip had been hidden. The metal still gleamed in a way that made the van seem like a relic of an easier, stranger time. The vehicle had been a carrier of goods, and briefly, a shelter. It had also been a vessel for something secret that allowed Naomi to trade, piece by careful piece, for the life she was remaking. She never painted over the rust, nor polished it until it shone. The van sat where it had always sat, quiet as a parked thought, passing the seasons like a patient companion. The shop, meanwhile, grew in the patient way of things built by hands. Naomi hired a young woman who had once been a regular and who needed a steady wage. Isaiah began to learn the ledger. He liked adding the numbers with a slow concentration that pleased his mother. Rose took to the sun like a little plant, yawning and absorbing warmth beside stacks of postcards and a jar of individually wrapped candies for customers to leave for children. Naomi would stand behind the counter and look out over customers who came not to see the drama of life played out, but to find something honest, a bouquet for a birthday, a crown for a child's recital, a wreath for a grieving house. People told her their troubles, and she held them with the small rituals of kindness: a ribbon, a wrapped stem, a hand placed lightly on an elbow. There was a quiet justice in that, not explosive, not televised, but steady and true. The van had been their inheritance and seemed worthless. Inside it had housed something valuable enough to seed a new life, but not so obscene that it could buy back everything. Naomi used it as a means, not as a proclamation. The fact that it had been discarded and belittled by those who took the rest of her life away made the irony bitter and sweet in equal measure. She did not need a spectacle to prove a point. The shop and the children were evidence enough. On a late summer evening, when the light fell in a honeyed slant through the front window, Naomi stood with a bouquet in her hands and listened to Isaiah read aloud the name of a customer on the order book. Rose slept with the soft sound of breath, like a small bell in traffic. A man paused at the door, watching the scene with the slight slackening of a person who has been given a moment of quiet in a hurried world. Naomi looked up. The van, parked down the street, caught 2 rays of sun on its ridge and flashed like a private star. They had handed her what looked like a relic, a vehicle meant to scavenge or to be pushed into the background. They had not seen what worth could mean when it was measured not in appearances, but in what a person could do with small, steady choices. Naomi thought of the way the metal had felt under her fingernail, cool, unassuming, secret and fragile in its own way. She thought of the life it had helped build, of a child named for roses and a son learning sums behind the counter. She thought of the in-laws who were learning their own lessons, slowly and without melodrama. Outside, the evening folded itself close. Naomi tied the ribbon on a bouquet and slid it across the counter to a woman who had come for the roses because her mother was coming home from the hospital. Naomi heard the gratefulness in the woman's voice and felt the small, hard currency of being useful, the kind that heals without announcing itself. If this story has touched you, please like and share it with someone who might need to hear how hidden worth can change the course of a life. Naomi did not think often of revenge. She thought of calculation, what seeds to plant, what to tend, how to make the days add up. She did not make her choices to wound. She made them to protect and to build. When she passed the van on her way home that evening, she reached out and touched the cool strip where, months ago, a sliver of gold had said its quiet yes to a different future. The rest of the world might see a crusted relic. She knew what it carried, not merely metal, but the means to remake a life with her own steady hands. The laugh that had followed the keys, the look of dismissed womanhood, the small violence of being cast adrift, those things sat like stones behind her. But there was a different kind of weight now, a counterweight of skill, of love, of a business that fed 2 children and a neighborhood. Naomi had been given a van that everyone agreed was worthless. They had no idea what it was worth to someone who needed not showy miracles, but a quiet bridge. The fortune it hid was not an end to struggle. It was the first plank of a new road. When Rose opened her eyes as if stirred by the light, Naomi smiled and thought of the future as a series of small acts repeated until they became a life. The van gleamed in that ordinary way, like a secret kept close. The in-laws folded into the life they would now have to make elsewhere. Naomi folded a last ribbon and set it in the drawer, wrapped the cash for the week's rent, and walked out into the dusk with 2 small people at her heels and a shop door closed gently behind her. They had handed her a rusty vehicle and thought it a joke. They had no idea it was worth a fortune, not because of what it could buy in a single day, but because of what it could make over time: safety, dignity, the slow flowering of a life rebuilt by patient hands.